Hey, this is Mark from zcarguide.com, and this is going to be a guide to replacing the ignition switch in a Datsun S30, that is 240Z, 260Z, or 280Z. We're going to be using this replacement ignition switch that I sell on my website, shop.zcarguide.com. If you use the code YouTube at checkout, I'll be happy to give you $5 off your order of an ignition switch. For tools, you're going to need regular Phillips and flathead screwdrivers, and I would also recommend having a long version of both of those screwdrivers. Just because of where the ignition switch is placed, it makes it a little bit easier to get to some of those screws. You're also going to need a Dremel with a cutting disc attachment and a shop rag. This is because we're going to be cutting a slot in the shear screws that you can use your flathead screwdriver to undo those screws, and the shop rag just kind of blocks some of the sparks. You're going to need a ratchet with a 7/32 inch socket and probably an extension, just because of, again, where that ignition switch is placed, and makes it a little bit easier to get some leverage. And I also found a crescent wrench necessary in tightening up one of the shear screw heads. You're also going to need a 1/2 inch or 13mm wrench to remove the negative battery terminal. And finally, a set of safety glasses. Because we'll be working close to some wiring, it's always a good idea to disconnect the battery. Next, we're going to be removing the plastic housing that goes around the steering column. There are 6 Phillips head screws on the underside of this plastic housing that you need to remove. To be completely honest, I was actually missing a couple screws here, so it's possible that those 2 that I was missing are actually not Phillips head screws, so just watch out for that. The plastic housing is composed of a top and a bottom that are joined together by these screws, so as you remove it, you're just going to want to separate the top from the bottom, exposing the steering column and our ignition switch. Take your Phillips head screwdriver and remove the Phillips head screws that secure the ignition switch to the steering column. As you can see here, this is where I used the long Phillips screwdriver. This is because the dashboard was getting in the way of the shorter Phillips screwdriver, and I didn't want to take any chance at stripping the head of those screws. Next, take your shop rag and secure it around the back of the ignition switch and try to block off any of the wiring there. This is going to protect it from the sparks when we use the Dremel. Make sure you put on your safety glasses first and take your Dremel and cut a small slot into the face of that screw. Be really mindful of all the things that you don't want to cut around there, like the wires or the dashboard. In fact, I make sure that I didn't even turn the Dremel on until it was right next to where I wanted to cut the screw, and that my left hand was ready to push it into the slot, and just try to minimize any potential loss of control that would result in cutting anything around there, because that Dremel will cut the dashboard, it will cut the wires, so just be careful. Realistically, it should only take a few seconds to actually cut a good slot in there. I think I probably went overboard. The top screw is a little bit harder to get to. I actually found it easier to put my hand through the top of the steering wheel, but as you can see, the dashboard is right there, so you really want to make sure that you again only turn it on when it's ready to go, and that you only have one motion, and that's towards the screw, just to minimize the chance of cutting the dashboard, because in case you haven't noticed, those are pretty expensive these days. Next, take your flathead screwdriver and remove these screws that you've cut a slot in. I did not end up needing to use the longer flathead screwdriver for this, just because, one, I didn't really care about stripping screws, but if you don't have such a good slot cut in there, you might want to have that longer screwdriver just to give you a little bit more leverage to remove those. These screws should become pretty loose very quickly, so you can just remove them by hand and then separate the 2 halves of the ignition switch. The main cable that attaches to the ignition switch should just pull right off. The replacement ignition switch should have shear screws that just turn by hand, so you can remove those to separate the 2 halves initially. Also reattach the plastic piece that goes around the keyhole of the new ignition switch. Inspect the terminal of the ignition switch and the cable that you're going to be inserting it into to make sure you're familiar with the orientation, and then it's simply just pushing it in. You may need to bend the tabs straight if they're not, but they are probably just already straight. Secure the new ignition switch into place by tightening the Phillips head screws. To ensure proper placement, insert the ignition switch locked so that you can see that the locking mechanism fits into the steering column. You probably will also be able to tell where the old ignition switch was by some fading or some discoloration around where the old one was. Next, insert the shear screws and tighten them by hand. Take your ratchet and tighten the shear screws until the heads just come off. It really shouldn't take too many turns past hand tight. You'll notice here that towards the top there, I actually had to use a crescent wrench. Again, it's just a little bit tight there, and that was the only thing that I could get enough leverage to turn it and remove that shear screw. Finally, go ahead and reinstall the plastic housing, reconnect the battery, and check that it works. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. Please let me know in the comments if you have any questions.